Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome to Data to Decisions, a practical guide to finding and using labor market information. In a moment, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues from RAnLab to get started. As folks are settling in, I encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're joining from today. Today's webinar is an initiative of the Future Skills Center Community of Practice. If you'd like to learn more about the work that we're doing, we will drop a link in the chat to our website where you can find more information. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to bring to your attention. We invite you to participate in the chat throughout the session. We will have people monitoring it and responding. Closed captioning is available for the session and can be activated in the Zoom toolbar below. We also have interpretation available for today's session. Une traduction bilingue est disponible pour cette session. Veuillez sélectionner la langue de votre choix. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you after the session, along with a companion resource. And so with that, I will hand it over to our presenters to get started.
Thanks, Sylvia. We're just going to pull up the slides.
Okay, are we good?
We're good.
Okay, so hello and thank you very much for that lovely introduction. My name is Jamie Ward and I'm the manager of the Regional Analytics Lab here in the Harris Center at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Before we start the presentation, we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We're here today to chat about some of our practical experiences in finding and using labor market data in this country. First, though, I really have to thank the Future Skills Center and Research Impact Canada for all of their support. It's what makes presentations like these and the engagement behind them and all the graphics you'll see today really possible. So thanks a lot. Okay, so RAnLab, as a little bit of an introduction, is a part of the Harris Center here at Memorial University that aims to support evidence-based policies for regional development through capacity building initiatives and regional economic and spatial analytics. For those unfamiliar with who we are, I'll explain a little bit more who we are in more detail in a moment. But first, I have to say that I'm joined today by my colleagues, Leslie Feltham here at my left and Kim Crosby across the table. We like to keep it pretty light around here, so you might hear them jump in and out as we go. If I say the wrong thing here and there. So a little bit about what we're talking about today. So welcome introductions. We're going to explain, as I said, a little bit of who we are at the Regional Analytics Lab, what we do, what our approach is, and then what we're here today to talk about finding and using labor market information. A little bit of an overview there. We're going to talk about some barriers, some very practical barriers that we find and that we discuss and we encounter a lot when working with local data. And then we'll run through some helpful resources that we found. Before we get on to the next slide, though, I'd like to say, as an organization, we really rely on interaction and feedback with real-world practitioners to guide and inform our work, including, again, all of the guides and graphics that you see here today and that we produce. As such, we really like using audience interaction when we're doing our presentation. So we're going to be using Slido as a tool today to learn a little bit about you all. I'm going to hand it over to Leslie now to introduce the program for those who haven't used it before and to get all of the wrinkles smoothed out.
All right. So as you can see on the screen, we're going to use Slido. And if you haven't used it before, it's an interactive tool that allows us to ask questions and then allows you to answer. And we'll both be able to see the answers live. So what you can do is scan the QR code with your cell phone camera, or you can visit slido.com and enter in the 4-digit code there. I'll give you guys a moment to set it up, but I'll bring up the next question. So the first question is, what hat are you wearing today? So in other words, what role do you play that involves LMI data, or what area of work are you in? We're just curious to know who's in our audience that's interested in learning about labor market information. And you can see the QR code on your screen still if you need to scan it. Lots of great answers there.
Very diverse group here today.
Researchers, a popular answer. Just give you a couple more moments to get some answers in.
It's nice we're seeing economic development and social economic development, which is great because RAnLab works with both sides, equally important. Okay.
Good. All right. So now that we know a little bit more about you all, I'll pass it over to Jamie to tell us more about RAnLab.
Thanks, Leslie. That's great. So what we do, well, like the Harris Center in general, we are a connection between the university here and Memorial and Newfoundland Labrador communities. So we're a little bit sort of in between here between the academics and the real world, as we say sometimes. Yeah. So, but rather than being a general catch-all term here at RAnLab, we really specialize a lot in. Just one second. It's covering up half of the slide. And this goes somewhere else. Sorry. So we're really like to say sometimes we really do a lot of the math around here. So we really aim to support evidence-based policies. So we support policies through partnerships and policy development. A lot of the times doing spatial analytics, regional economic analysis, we deal with a lot of data issues. We actually started a little over, I think, 10 years ago now to help fill a need primarily within the province, but within Atlantic Canada in general, I think, for more sub-provincial analysis, for more data below the provincial level, below the national level, geographically speaking. There's lots and lots of great stuff we'd be reading about in literature in academic journals, and that we'd be seeing nationally, internationally at conferences. And we thought, hey, that could be very helpful in local planning. And so we've been here as part of the Harris Center now, as I say, for about a decade, a little bit more than a decade. And we sort of run around doing whatever needs to be done on this part. And so in terms of sort of statements, in terms of what it is that we could say that we do, as I said before, we really try to inform evidence-based analysis and decision-making. And practically what this means in a lot of cases is that we provide practical and helpful tools that support local capacity building. So what that means in real terms is that means that we're flexible. That means that when we go out and we meet with community groups or with government levels, different sort of specific problems, challenges they're working on. And, sometimes it's a lot of customization. It's a lot of finding different data sources, different types of analysis. We use tools, whatever people are comfortable with. We've presented dashboards and analyses in Microsoft Excel before, because that's what people use. That's what people have. We've printed off dashboards and went to remote areas and whatnot and everything, so that don't have such internet and everything. So it's very much oriented in that way. We develop custom models naturally. A lot of the fun in this, a lot of the power in this type of work is making things fit for purpose. And so a lot of times local planning needs, when you're talking, say, demographic models or economic models, can differ from what's commonly available on the national level or internationally. And so a lot of this is customization, bottom-up programming and whatnot. Everything we do, pretty much, I can almost say that unqualified, almost everything we do is through partnerships. We have a lot of chats with people. We have a lot of connections. We do a little bit of a lot of big projects. We tend to here, and a lot of times it's about that local data perspective, either with academic researchers or with different agencies and decision makers. Naturally, in the process of doing that, we work with a lot of local data, because when you're doing local modeling, local context is absolutely critically important. And so we tend to work with a lot of diverse data sources that we have to make work together somehow. We've been doing this for a while now. And again, as I mentioned sort of in the beginning of the slide, outputs are flexible. We develop things to meet specific requirements. And that means that we are flexible. That means that we really try to meet people where they are. One other thing I will say, though, is, as I mentioned, so we began starting with a lot of analysis, but we've been moving, I think, more in the past 5 years or so towards more and more capacity building activities like this, because it is very nice. It is convenient if people can understand what it is that you're saying a little bit sometimes. So, one of the important things to get through here to come from this is it's not enough to just have data. It's not just going to the Stats Canada page and getting a variable often. Often it's not the case. Often, it has to be useful. It has to connect with what you're trying to do. And we'll talk later on in the presentation about sort of the steps that we step through to do this. But data models and analyses are for policy development plan. They're here to support that process and push that process forward, facilitate it. So, these are all things we'll talk a bit in more depth later on. But so it's important to engage with the data itself and with what you're doing with it to learn the areas of weakness within your decision-making processes that data can find. So it's not going to come in and, often it doesn't drape over your entire process, but it has bits and pieces it can add. You have to interrogate administrative sources for gaps. So often the data that you get, you have to know what it is that you're using, right? So you have to get into it. You have to understand what some of the issues might be, what some of the application cases might be. For this, transparency is absolutely critical. We really want to encourage, I always encourage people to read all of the files that come with the files, just so we have a sense of any sort of weaknesses or any sort of built-in caveats as things come. We've really gotten to the habit often when we are providing statistical information for people or modeling results. We more often than not couple them now with guides so that core key concepts are explained, at least from our perspective, as they've been intended. And this really helps facilitate further engagement and deeper engagement with the results. We want people complaining about the numbers. We want people coming back and asking pointed questions. Where did this come from? And I find this empowers people a lot, and it really helps it do that. It helps it work.
All right, thanks, Jamie. So now that you know more about RAnLab's expertise, we'd like to know your comfort level with using data. So the question is, how familiar are you with accessing and using data to inform your work? So 1 is, I need a lot more practice, and 5 is, I am a data expert. So this will help us today and also know how to keep developing our resources and how advanced they should be. And again, the QR code's on the side there if you need to scan it again.
A lot of solid threes.
Yeah. Good, and we'd love to see the people at the very introduction level. That's great. All right, we'll just give it a couple more seconds. All right, I guess we're good to go. So now Jamie is going to get us started with an introduction to labor market information.
Okay, thank you. Actually, it's a funny term to define, really. So that is one more thing to mention about what we do. Is we are not focused solely on labor market information. Being here at the position we're in, we deal with data across the board. So we work on projects with labor market information. We've worked on projects in healthcare and education and environmental data, and so we have a bit of a contextual perspective here. We can see a bit of a broad perspective, a little bit with what we work with. But the labor market information, I guess there's a number of definitions going around, but in short, it's information that has to do with the labor market, that helps you understand a little bit more about the labor market, about what's going on, about how it's working. So we have here, it refers to data and insights with the supply and demand for labor in a particular geographic region or industry. So this includes, obviously, based on your boundaries, this can include an awful lot of things. It includes, job vacancies, wages, employment trends, skills we have here, employment trends, unemployment, participation rates, these sorts of things. Sometimes skills required for specific occupations. One of the things we find very practically when you're working with this stuff is geography and industry classifications tend to be fairly widespread. And so these are classifications of sort of either the StatsCan geography classifications, we'll talk about a little bit, industry classifications, industry codes, occupation codes, these sorts of things tend to be, for a lot of the more foundational data sets, at least these things are sort of almost required reading or required understanding before getting into this. Because of course, I mean, this is important to note because this isn't just used. One of the things that is really, I think, distinct about labor market information is it is not just used by researchers or analysts who are, in the institution, as you could say. It's used by a very wide range of people. Job seekers, can use a lot of the stats and everything in the job bank, people looking to get into education. Businesses can use it to plan their workforce needs, and policymakers, of course, labor market policies and programs, different levels of government. It's very widespread. It's one of these things that a lot of people, there's a lot of people very interested in how this works. So of course, this leads us to an interesting point, I think, because when we were putting this webinar together, the temptation was really there to create a readout shopping list of different data sources. What specifically are the points you can go and you can get labor market information. But for a couple of reasons, we're going to use a little bit of a different approach here today. On the one hand, this is a national audience, it's a huge diverse country. And a lot of the caveats or the weaknesses or barriers that you find in specific data sets are either localized or not the same for everybody. And so that's one thing that we have to be aware of. On the other hand, there's been so much change in the last 5 years or so, in particular, in the amount, in sort of the data sources themselves and the variables they're using, in some of the different qualities and quantities that they have. And we really want to make sure that what we're saying is accurate and that we're up to date. So what we've decided to do instead, in concert with our sort of philosophy of community engagement, is we are making a companion document to go along with this seminar, where we profile individual data sources. You should find this, I think, in about a week, either on Magnet or our own website or through social media. We think we got a lot of the main ones covered, but we really wanted to throw it at the audience first to see what suggestions are out there. So I'm going to hand this back to Leslie now for another Slido question.
All right, so the next question is, what are some of your go-to data sources? And as Jamie mentioned, we're going to have some examples coming up in the slides, but we really want to know what you're finding useful. So you can go ahead and list as many as you like, and after we'll compile them into a list and send to you. Statistics Canada is a popular one.
Absolutely.
So you can think about too in your local community, maybe there's a specific local resource you use.
And if you have a couple you want to put in, you just use the add response button below your text entry line, and you'll be able to put in more than one response.
Still a few more coming in.
Saw Harris Center pop up, and I didn't put it in there.
Some provincial sources, some federal sources.
Fantastic.
All right. All right. I think we're good. And so we'll just give you a couple more seconds. And then Jamie's going to jump in and talk a bit more about data sources. All right. I think we're good to go, Jamie.
Okay. So in lieu, I guess, of a replacement of starting to go through specifically some of these things, when we were talking about this, we really felt it's a good idea because one of the issues with finding and using labor market information is the data sources that you can see there can be plentiful, but they can be incredibly helpful when they're used appropriately and when you can work out a bit of organization around what can feel like chaos sometimes. So what we did in our discussions around this is we really felt it's helpful to break this up into a couple of different categories when you're looking out there, when you're looking at the data, looking to find things. And so these are our own categories. These are for reference purposes almost. It just helps to organize them a little bit. And we find it's helpful to think of things first in terms of foundational data and foundational sources. One of the things I noticed that stood out to me on that page I sent is how often Stats Canada comes up. Stats Can is an absolutely core place to know if you're looking for data in almost any area in this country. And so that's really what we would consider a foundational source, it is, I guess, the holder of foundational sources, the creator of them. And so some of the properties of this type of data, this is sort of baseline or platform data. It's data that is ubiquitous, fairly, or at least it's commonly known enough by experts in your area that you could talk about. This is something that you can call someone up and say, hey, what's going on in the labor force survey? And you have a pretty good idea that they would answer. So these are baseline data sets. They tend to be consistent over time, so that means that they're reliable, and in a lot of their methods, so you can pick out different years and have confidence that it would be relatable. They tend, again, I guess, if they're consistent, they would have to be temporal in that way, and they tend to be have specific regular time periods over a long period. A really critical and a feature that you often find is that they tend to be very transparent about their methods. They tend to have metadata available and clearly defined. Metadata, for those who are unfamiliar, is data about data. Often when you go to a place like Stats Canada and you click that download all button, it will come often either with a footnote or with a separate table that is called metadata. And it has sorts of things that's good to know, basically how much you can trust and sort of what sort of little caveats you need to build in to your interpretation. Things like sample design, things like error rates, things like that, right? We'll talk a little bit about that later on. We do have a graphic. We have many graphics about things that we'll get into. So examples of this, as I mentioned, labor force survey, the job bank is fairly reliable. The survey, the number of monthly surveys that you can find, employment, payrolls, and hours. The census is very well known, very common. A lot of these things you can find in the daily Stats Canada, the regular sort of released ones. You go to the website, you can find them on the front page. It's this sort of level. After that, so once you exhaust sort of the regular sources or the classic sources, we have what we're terming supplemental or supplementary sources. These are sources that are a little bit less common, a little bit less ubiquitous. Maybe they have special caveats. Often they arise out of need. It could be a provincial program or an industry association wanting to know a little bit more about farming or about fishing or about manufacturing or what have you in an area. And so, they might not be so common. They might be common. They might be something else. They tend to illuminate what the foundational sources don't. And often, at least they intend to bridge the gap between what's available and what's not. Yes.
Sorry, Jamie, I didn't screw you off here.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, the characteristics can vary. For this, the metadata, as I mentioned, becomes very important. If you're getting sort of different sources or different data sets from different sources, you have to carefully consider where it's coming from, sampling designs, methodologies, definitions, things like that. Different provinces and territories will have different data sets available, sometimes from different sources. Sometimes you can find these sorts of things on websites. You can find them in open data portals sometimes. You can find them through open access to information requests, sometimes in repositories. Workforce innovation centers are a lovely source of this type of information often. We have a very active group here in Newfoundland and Labrador that do very good work, something to check out. Yeah, and so, yeah, so sometimes you'll see these from university research. Can often give a high degree of specificity in local issues, and sometimes from private companies. You'll see a lot of the Lightcast derived job posting data. This is really something that really illuminates certain areas very well, and something that is nice to check out. Of course, this is a lot of words to sort of get into something that it's not a replacement. This is all a journey. The whole point of this is so that we can make sure that we have a comprehensive approach and a full, accurate picture of labor market conditions. There is a third category that we like to add on here and think about, and this is especially true for labor market information, which is complementary data. And we like to think about this as data that's not necessarily considered LMI, labor market information, but it's still important to consider. And often it can come with its own sort of rules and interpretations. Housing data could be considered complementary to this, I guess, based on your perspective. Immigration data, and sometimes can come from very different places. Yeah, and so also consider qualitative data and information from different qualitative studies and sources can really help illuminate different areas and different issues. You really want to investigate to the most granular level possible. So for instance, something may look like it's working on a provincial level, but more detailed data can sometimes indicate subprovincial differences. A comprehensive approach to data sources illustrates a fuller picture of labor market conditions. So this has been a little bit of a summary overview. We will be taking your suggestions and fleshing out our companion document. And this will help drive down through this a little bit more later on when we see it. So building on that, I figured we should talk about the process a little bit. It's not, as I said in my intro, it's often not about strictly just getting simple, discrete data sources. This is a process. You're not getting data for the just idly. I mean, often, you're looking for data because you have an issue or a question that you're trying to solve or illuminate in some way. And so we have here, this is the graphic. This is the data journey. This is Stats Canada's outline sort of creation. It's this sort of encapsulates very well, I think, the process that you go through in very relatable terms of getting through this. So you can see everything from defining your question, finding data, gathering the data. And the second step, you clean it, you describe it, basically explore it, figure out what it is, make it fit for purpose. And then you analyze it, you get to answer your question, and then you have your outputs, you tell your story. So this is a process that just sort of cycles sometimes. Some helpful things to remember about this, some notes that we've made. Always define a research question, define your geography and outline indicators. It's really easy to get overwhelmed with all of the data that's out there and the different sources and the different levels. So by making a definition first about what it is that you're doing, it gives you something to use that help sort of tamp down on the distraction and keep focused. A research question is not necessarily set in stone here. You want to revisit it and sort of roll it around in your mouth a little bit. Consider making changes as necessary as things come up, as you learn information. You might start with a question looking at what you think is a root cause, and you want to look at something, but then by getting some data and thinking about it and talking to some people, you might get some clues that it's actually a hint to a further root cause or a more localized phenomenon, which is different from what you thought in the beginning. So it can really help get into that. You want to start with your foundational sources. As we said, start with the more widely available sources. Use the most trustworthy and transparent sources first. Keeping in mind that trustworthy is a very active question for a lot of these things, and it just, in my mind, encourages the need for transparency. So you start with what's known, and these sources have a high degree of certainty and transparency. So if something looks off, if something doesn't resonate with your gut, you have somewhere to start. You can read the metadata. You can ask people questions. There will be people around who know these things, or at least can give you some insight. This helps by starting there. It helps create a foundation or a baseline for understanding the greater picture, and it really helps vet some of the other sources you might find that might be a little bit less transparent. This is really, really important if you're working in a rural area, to have some sense of orientation with this. And of course, you can always keep just checking back in to the research question, because I mean, you really want to be finding gaps, finding out what parts of the question you can't solve, or you can't have any sort of confidence with, and what other information is needed. And then after you go through that step, you can explore the data sets. You want to relate your findings back to your research question and find out what's missing. So you really want to find that understanding and narrow your search down. And at this point, you really dive into more focused data sets. No matter what we're dealing with, no matter what data sets you're looking at, you want to approach them all with a critical eye. As I mentioned, carefully review the metadata, download it, at least keep it on near the file somewhere, and then you want to trust your gut. We often say to partners that we work with around our province, around our region, that they're the ones that know their area best. And it's a different sort of perspective than what you find just from data sometimes. And this really helps to reconcile between what you're seeing versus what you're feeling, or what you've noticed, or what you might be getting told by people. And this is really about evaluating both the data and your gut in sort of this sort of reciprocal way. You want to trust the transparency. A good data source clearly defines its metadata. It doesn't mean that you believe everything it's presenting, but it means you can use it to guide your interpretation. And finally, most importantly, as sort of a pressure relief valve here, is if you're just overwhelmed and you can't find what you're looking for, ask for help. There's lots of local data experts around the country, between local universities, town offices, people around private companies, lots of people who may be able to help you, or at least they might be able to connect you with someone who can. And of course, you can always reach out to RAnLab. Any questions, we're always here for questions. I'll put my plug in there. Now, I believe Leslie has another Slido question.
One last question. All right, so we added in this question to help give people an opportunity to share their networks and get a sense of who you can contact when you need help with data. So you can go ahead and share the names of specific people or organizations that you can contact when you need support. And you can think about local data experts within your networks.
The responses we get from this will be forwarded out to the group afterwards.
Yes.
Right? So all the information that we get from the Slido slides, that will be part of the, I guess, the material that gets sent out afterwards. One of the questions that just came actually into the post while we were doing this in the chat was from Sandy. And Sandy, I'm not sure where you're located. I didn't see you back through the listing, but what resources does RAnLab have that can assist at a local census division or the census subdivisions? And of course, as we go across the country, that has a lot of different implications. RAnLab has built its expertise and most of our work through Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada. But the issues that we have and things that we're talking about as we go through the presentation certainly apply right across the country. But Jim, I don't know if you want to make a comment on that now while we're getting some of these things coming in, or will you address it maybe later?
Sorry, what was the question?
So the question was on what types of resources can RAnLab have that can assist at the CD and CSD level?
Okay, yeah.
For Newfoundland,
Yeah.
not just for the whole country.
Yeah, well, I think you'll see some resources later on. Some of our activities around this, around helping to clarify on a basic level, what some of these classifications are. What does it mean? We have some pretty wild geographies in this province, at least when you look at both census subdivisions and census division. And it's always a nice conversation with people. Oh, nice shout out to Sarah Breen.
What's that?
That's a nice shout out to Sarah Breen. She was a grad student here.
Oh.
There you go. Sorry.
I just wanted to add, if you don't have a connection with a data expert, maybe you can type that in the box too and say you're looking for connections. Maybe that's something we can help support in the future.
So we can certainly circle back and talk more later on once we get through.
I think too, at the end of the presentation, we also have a general slide, but looking for areas of focus where people would like to learn more or know more. So, yeah, I think Jamie always says, ask. Then there's a question to ask. We might be able to help, but we might be able to, or direct you somewhere else. So, yeah, there's never a no. Lots of great results coming in.
Yeah, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Yeah, so Jamie has an example now to walk us through to demonstrate how RAnLab engages with communities and supports them through data analytics.
Perfect. So, if we think back to that the data journey slide a little while ago about sort of the process we go through when you're presented with a question, you're presented with a challenge, and the process of finding data and using data. This is something that isn't that I can say at least varies tremendously in capacity on the local level. There are some towns, there are some cities that have fantastic teams and fantastic people that understand this stuff. But at least in our province, it is not ubiquitous. There are some areas that have challenges. There's some areas that don't really involve very much at all. And so what we're going to talk about here now, as Leslie mentioned, this is an example of a process that we went through a couple of years ago with some of our local partners about how to use data, how to find it, how to learn a little bit about it as you're going. So first of all, this project we did a few years ago was called Big Data, Big Ideas. It was a partnership with municipalities in Newfoundland and Labrador and ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. And really what it did, it allowed us to partner directly with cities and towns. So at the end of it, we had 31 municipalities that signed up. There was a city and different towns, both within census agglomerations, more urban areas, and some very, very rural, remote areas as well included in here. Then the goal for this project from the beginning was to provide communities across Newfoundland and Labrador with data and information that is useful and aligned with the specific interests of the community to help them make evidence-based development decisions. And it's an interesting challenge, right? Because I mean, they're looking for data, they're looking for information, but at the same time, they're lacking the capacity in a lot of cases, either to gather it or to interpret it or to do much with it necessarily from a decision-making perspective. And so this was a pretty comprehensive project where, if we follow the dots here, at the end of the day, the product of this was fact sheets that we produced with baseline demographic and economic data. So we did that first. So there was an application process, and there's a lot of concern. Basically, we asked what issues they were having, struggling with, that they think that they could know a little bit more data about. And so we crafted basic fact sheets with the foundational data that we could find on these areas. So they identified demographic, economic areas, very general. Once we have the first round of data sheets, we met with community representatives across the board. Of course, this was starting during COVID lockdown, so there's a lot of phone calls, more so than Zoom calls in those days, with this audience. And then after that process, they really helped focus in on some of the issues that they were interested in. And we crafted customized fact sheets that was more specific to the issues that they were concerned with. So housing markets, labor force skills, these sorts of issues. So we ended up with these lovely fact sheets that combine both the stats and the interpretation that comes with it, basically how to use it, localized for their very specific communities. And it really, there were challenges with this because of the diversity and the sizes of some of these communities and the capacities of them. The challenges with using only foundational data There's a lot of suppression even in census data with some of these municipalities. And unfortunately, what is not available and sometimes can be just as important as what is available. It's a real tragedy that sometimes the communities and areas that could really stand to benefit the most from this type of resource are the ones that are, on the one hand, have the least capacity to do it, but on the other hand, they seem to have more barriers. The data just isn't as accessible. An awful lot of housing data is available only on particular geography levels. And so this was a revolving issue for a couple of years, particularly in Indigenous areas and rural areas, defining some of the housing challenges was a real source of focus for a while there. And so one of the most important things, I think, at the end of all of these bundles of fact sheets that we produced for every municipality, we always had a sheet about gaps and challenges and data sources so that people can go a little bit of a discussion about what it was that they said would be useful to have that we couldn't find or that wasn't commonly available to help sort of provide a little bit of conversation going forward. Now, barriers to working with local data. So this is a little bit of a transition. A lot of the reason why we took this approach with these towns across the province is because Newfoundland and Labrador is, from a data perspective, from a classification perspective, in a lot of ways, it's a rural province. So 45% of the population lives outside of CMAs and CAs. So 55% lives inside of our CMA, our one CMA, and our few CAs. But when you're looking from a political decision-making perspective, 90% of the 276 municipalities are in that rural area, or in those rural areas scattered around all over the province, Newfoundland and Labrador. And this means that a lot of the conversations we have with people, a lot of the questions we get from mayors and town councils and clerks and whatnot are dealing with areas that have either capacity challenges or challenges about sort of using the data itself. But as we transition now to talk a little bit more generally about some of these barriers, it's important to keep in mind that this is something that is present. This is something that's a real challenge out there. It's an ongoing, I won't say struggle, but it's a job. It's a job to get through these things. Expanding beyond Newfoundland and Labrador, you have 16% by our calculation of the population lives outside of CMAs or CAs. But when down on that census subdivision level, that municipal equivalent level from Stats Canada, about 80% are in that rural or outside of those as well. And so when you're talking about decision makers as a discrete unit, it's something to know, it's something to be aware of. That often it's you can go and you can click and you can get, say, the CMA download for the city of Toronto or the city of Calgary or the city of St. John's. And just to keep in mind, if you want to replicate that analysis, you want to replicate that work for Bonavista, it's a different process. Sometimes it's a bit more involved process, and it involves some pretty specific barriers that we can talk about. Now, so barriers really, what we're going to talk about here now, in some ways, they represent hiccups through that data journey list, the Stats Canada list that we talked about a little bit before. And they really reinforce the sense of organization. That's really good to have when approaching these things. You'll notice that we have graphics on these slides going forward. These were generated for either our Insight Bites that we have through the support of Future Skills and Research Impact Canada, or through our Data Decisions course that came from the same thing. So this is very much made possible by the support we've received. You can find these on Magnet, or you can find them on our own website. We have lots of resources around, or you can always just email if you see something you like and you like to see a copy. I'm sure someone can forward things. It's important to note, though, before I get into details here, that you'll notice that these were all driven by the knowledge and the difficulties that we learned about in discussing things with our partners, things that we've heard about. So all of these graphics, all of the work we've done has all been done because somebody had a problem with it at some point, and there was a gap that needed to be filled. And so we've really been focusing these insight bites on different barriers and helping people deal with things in different ways. So when we're talking about barriers with local data, practically speaking, in our experience, we can really break them down into two general groups. The first group is systematic structural knowledge. That's sort of received information that's required or helpful to use labor market information. Like I mentioned before, if this was a community purely of researchers that had master's or PhD degrees, this would be less of a concern. But a lot of the practice of using labor market information is being done, in town halls and economic development offices around the country that might have variously sort of diverse backgrounds. Everyone isn't going to be an economist understanding how these things work. So what we've been trying to do here is make these sort of, resources that are a little bit more literate, but still have all of the information in there. So the first thing we have here is understanding of classifications, and that has come up repeatedly in work projects we've worked on as a barrier to working with the data. About a year and a half ago, I actually got a phone call from an elderly relative doing an application, and she said, "Oh, what is this NAICS code I have to put in? I have to put in a NAICS code. How am I supposed to figure out what that is?" And so it really sort of clued me in that this is a widespread issue. There's a lot of these classifications around, so that people might not know. So NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification System codes, it's a system that's used to standardize industry classifications. And so you'll go, people might be familiar with the 20 codes, the 2 digits that you can get. So if you want to check in on manufacturing or construction, but it's a fully nested system that goes right up to 6 digits and 928 industries based on the data set. So there's different classifications. There's industries, there's occupations, there's commodities, there's the geographic classification system. These are all things that are sort of underlying a lot of, especially the foundational data. That's really helpful to have a little bit of understanding about. So second, related to that, but second to that is the issue of geography. As I mentioned, there's an awful lot of Statistics Canada data that conforms to the standard geographical classification that they have. And what this means is that it's a classification, it's a system that has specific laid out rules about sort of where the boundaries are and how things are defined, geographically speaking. So on the one hand, one issue is this means that you can have sometimes, in our case, say in St. John's, you might go and look, I'll go get St. John's data. And you might get CMA data for the census metropolitan area, or you might get municipal data for the municipality. And it's all just part of the classification. It's something within the metadata, within the variable name to be aware of. Another barrier arising from geography, as I mentioned before, with a lot of data, is there's a lot of data sets out there. A lot of the, dare I say, coolest data sets, they're only available sometimes for CMAs or CAs or parts of them. And so this is a tough issue for some communities when, you might see an analysis or you might see a report from the city and you get a phone call from someone and say, hey, can I have that too? And it's constrained by geography. And so this is, something to be aware of. Second, or third here, knowledge of algorithms. When we're talking about a lot of, dare I say, heavy analysis or sort of work, if you're talking different types of population projections, the algorithms made to create these things have implications for the interpretation often. And so knowing what the heck a cohort survival model is talking about, or a location quotient is talking about, or a Gini coefficient is talking about, is absolutely a barrier to working with some of these things, because this is how they come out sometimes. And finally, and one of the more curious ones is to stay on top of changes. A lot of these classifications are in flux. They're changing all the time. The geography classification, there is a number of census agglomerations that were promoted to census metropolitan areas this time. City of Fredericton is in there. And so this is going to affect going forward where this goes. You also have some shrinking. So Bay Roberts here in Newfoundland, I think Cold Lake in Alberta were both downgraded from census agglomerations. And so this is probably going to affect the data available from these areas going forward, which if it happens is a shame because we really like using, we like having as much data as we can to use there. So second, from the more systematic, universal type barriers, we also have local challenges and barriers. And these are things that can vary based on where you are within a data set. Uncertainty and reliability is certainly a huge issue when you download a data set. And in that example I just mentioned, where someone sees something from an urban area or from a province and says, hey, can we have that as well? Sometimes, you look up the data and it can have, you can certainly find issues. You notice here below, sort of on the left side of the screen, what we have here is something that a lot of people may be familiar with, especially in some of the supplementary sources, data sources that you might come across. In a lot of Stats Canada survey data in particular, is they'll have data quality symbols, these little superscripts, these letters that are above the numbers. And this is another thing that we heard of it from our partners. It's a pain having to remove these from the numbers because they interfere with interpretation. But what this is something that has meaning. They have value, you can see here on the right, this is a graphic that we did up to help explain a little bit where these come from and the importance of transparency and the importance of sort of factoring it into your understanding of these things. Because it varies by provinces, there are certain data sets that you will get here, and you look at a larger province, Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, and you will see a superscript across the board for 25 years of monthly data. Then you look up a smaller province, say Newfoundland and Labrador or Prince Edward Island, and it will either be suppressed, or you might have a 1 month mixed with a D, mixed with a C, and it really tends to impact, it will influence a little bit of how much you lean on it, how much you use it. Secondly, we have so we also have an explanation here of metadata, where that comes from, what that means, some of the things you find in it. And the last thing I really want to mention here is, in terms of a local challenge, local barrier, is the appropriate application of statistics. Sometimes when you are working in a local area, it can be tempting or challenging to know that what you think you're saying is actually what you're saying. We do have an example here that comes up fairly often in our part of the world, which is the ecological fallacy with population change. It's an illustrated example. And so for a lot of things, if you're doing labor market planning on a rural area of the province, you can go and you could very, relatively easily find a province level census profile or population projection. But you have to resist the temptation of applying that for a lot of your local decision making. You see here in this example, the province in the 10 years, 2006, 2016, grew by about 3%. But within that, on the local areas, there was a tremendous amount of variation. You had the capital here in St. John's grew by 14%, while the Northern Peninsula in the north of the island declined by 14%. So you can imagine the local labor market implications here are not really relatable between the two. And so this is just something as a barrier, a challenge to keep in mind as you're going forward. So I guess we're getting close to the end here now. So a little bit about what we're doing, about the work that we do going forward. We are continuously developing and refining our data models and our analytical models, I guess you can say, to roll with changes and questions that we get. We are continuously producing data literacy resources. I'd like to chat with people, so we have a lot of engagement with partners and everything. And so, yeah, answering questions. another thing. And so the big question, how else can we help? So before we finish up here, we just have some quick resources. I really wanted to show out here to Stats Canada's Learning Catalog. A lot of the things that I talked about today to sort of touch on and sort of give an overall view of, you can really go on there and really, they have courses, they have videos, you can really get down to it. We have our own Data to Decisions course on our website that helps sort of walk through the 5 topics here and sort of getting through that. And here at the end, we have a collection of some of our graphics. So we have explanation of NAICS codes, of the occupation codes, FYI, another classification that's had some changes. So if you're used to using it 10, 15 years ago, you should check in again. They did a big overhaul in 2021 about some of the skills. We have one here on data releases. I really got a shout out for Leslie for her supernatural skills for creating some of these things. And then data quality symbols. And finally, the labor market information sources. This is the companion document that you'll be learning about next week or within the week probably. And this will profile the different data sources. So you can see here, we have some of the examples here up already. Yeah, so this is it. I think
Good.
we're good.
So we just have time now for any questions.
Okay, we haven't had many questions come in during the presentation. But you just got to shout out Jamie on loving the slides on NAICS and NOx.
It's people should visit the Signal Hill campus here in St. John's. We have them all up on the screens too. So people are learning if it NAICS and NOx, whether they really want to or not.
Before we jump into the Q&A, we do have another 15 minutes for that. We just wanted to do a quick wrap up for anyone who does need to hop off the call. We're going to launch a very quick Zoom poll. If you could just give us, take a few moments to give us a little bit of feedback about the session. This will help us with our future events. I also wanted to let you know about how you can connect with us. So we have a Conversations to Community newsletter for the Community of Practice. We share events, resources, and highlight some of the really excellent work that is happening in the sector. So we will drop a link to that in the chat if you'd like to stay connected and learn more. And then as a reminder about the follow-up items, you will receive an email in a few days to a week's time with the recording of the presentation, the slides, and the companion resource that was mentioned. So if you could, yeah, and once again, take a few minutes to fill out the quick poll, that would really help us. And with that, Kim, I'll hand it back over to you, and we can do a little Q&A if anybody has any questions.
Great. Okay. And we do have one in, and some of the comments that are coming in as well. I'll also highlight those. I know there's some more data sources coming in. And so anything that is put in the chat, if you ran out of time using Slido, we'll certainly take a copy of the chat as well and include them in. So this one, Jamie talks about data modeling. Just wondering what type of data modeling RAnLab has done and how you've gone about it.
Oh,
so
okay.
I hope you have next hour.
Okay. Oh no. Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. So no, we. Yeah. I guess I'm not prepared. We can say very generally. A lot of our work with that tends to be. I don't want to say hand them out, but it tends to be very sort of community driven or partner driven. So honestly, just one example for the data to decisions, the big data, big ideas work for that. A lot of that was done in Power BI, Microsoft Power BI. I find myself drawn to that, the ecosystem with this type of work often because of the ubiquity of Microsoft Excel with people. And so it's a little bit of a half step to get people on board. And so, no, I mean, yeah, so we just sort of, as part of the process to help, improve the responsiveness and the scalability with that, as we downloaded, so we access through the APIs or whatever, a lot of the foundational sources, the census, labor force survey things. connected them up in Power BI. There's a number of different sources you can use. We've used Excel Power Query often in different projects sometimes to make a nice little, compact, quasi database thing for people that they can just sort of be able to filter and whatnot in.
I'll just add a quick little bit there, and because I have 7 new messages. I don't know if they're all questions or congratulations, but
Okay.
let me get through them. Just some of the examples of the modeling work I think that RAnLab has done. And these are some of the bigger projects that we get involved with at either the provincial government level, Atlantic Canadian government level. But the population project was a really big model that you actually developed. We think about that. So looking at the demography that's going on, all the different characteristics, and then looking at how that's going to change projection going forward. And then with that demography model, we connect that to LMI data. So looking at how different regions of our province will change over time and how we're going to meet the needs of the workforce based on our current population trends going on in those areas. We've also done work on health related work with some of our facilities and organizations here, looking at how can we better work with our, how can the province work better with our health delivery on, again, looking at those changing population demographics, services, supply demand model that RAnLab's developed is also substantial. So they're all, I guess, discussions. But a lot of this work comes from a custom request where they're looking at, here's the straightforward data, how can we apply it to this problem to help with evidence-informed decision-making? And that's usually always the start of the conversation for the work. And what Jamie has done, I think, over the last 10 years, you said you've hit so many different sectors.
And I mean, we used to have a slide that we always had of the listing of our partners, and it was too much of a distraction.
Yeah.
It's just so long.
Okay, so I'll move on to this next question. And again, if there's anything follow-up, put them in, and some things we can respond to certainly offline. What is your perspective regarding the definition of rural areas by Statistics Canada, and how other provinces define rural regions?
Oh, this is again, this is a bit of a long question, but I can just say, I think pretty quickly that I as part of sort of the role of the job here, I like to separate a lot of my feelings around this. It's certainly, I fought it for a long time, but you got to admit it's certainly convenient to be able to use the CMA or CAs and everything that's not that. Sometimes in data sets when they don't explicitly produce variables for non-CMA or CA areas, they will have CMA, CA, and the whole province. So at least you can get your hands dirty a little bit with some of this. But it's I don't know anyone who's familiar with a bit of the system and what we're doing here in Newfoundland and Labrador is we don't have so much of a formal intermediate system, cadastral, and sort of regional county system here, and so we're really dependent on a lot of the stats on a lot of these sort of our census divisions and CFD as they're defined by Stats Canada. I know in the product I've worked on, the products I've worked on across in the Maritimes in Ontario, is it's a little bit more intuitive sometimes when you have an actual named county to work with.
I think too, some of the frustrations come in, or not the frustrations, but the reason why we do so much local connection with what we're doing is because of the definitions and how they're applied. So we have to work with the communities. We call up town halls and we've had students who live in communities supplement data to help fill in some of those gaps. Because it's critical.
And it's true, right? A lot of the questions we're asked, a lot of the things that we're asked to be involved with are because people are working on very practical things. I mean, if you have a funding application to go in, you have boxes you got to fill out. You have variables that they're looking for, and so that helps calm down where the academic sometimes with these things is that it's about working with the systems.
Okay. We do have a couple of resources that were put in that I've seen previous. First of all, I'll just give a shout out to Newfoundland's Workforce Innovation Center and the supplementary learning materials that they produce. I know, Jamie, you mentioned them earlier in the conversation, and we'll put those in our resource list. Sharon's added in a few extra specific ones. We also have from the tech sector, some great tech sector resources that's been added in. I'm not sure who that's from right now, but anyway, that will definitely be added to our list as well. And now a question, what would be some quick tips for establishing good data? Is there anything that can be identified quickly when looking at a website, for example? And previously someone asked about Google and reliability on that one. I'll tie those
Okay.
together.
Okay, well, I mean, and again, if there's other people that have other suggestions, again, we like to have the conversation. I'm not the oracle. Even though I am on top of the hill right now, I'm not, this is it. But no, I would say, you can start to look for signs. The very presence of metadata, the very presence, if people are willing to talk about their methodology. Transparency for this stuff that's number one. Even if it's good, people make mistakes sometimes, right? So be able to track back and see where these things come from. I'd say that's really my first filter when I'm looking and trying to evaluate data sources first. Is that. Secondly, from that, it comes down to some of those classifications. I'll filter directly for if things are available sometimes on the census subdivision level or the dissemination area level sometimes, because it's the population example there. There's some things that just even if it's available for the provincial level or the national level or in another province, sometimes we deal with students and whatnot coming with questions. You can get yourself into trouble. You can really get into sort of cycles of more and more and more work getting through that. So that's if I was going to say one thing, at least if you can find metadata, at least you can get it down. You may not be able to understand what the heck they're talking about in there, but that is something that you can send to an analyst or a researcher or a university, and they'll be able to decipher it and take it back from you. But that's the.
I think something that I've seen too, just a bit more general nature, and we've been dealing with it more locally as reports are being produced or you're going to websites, you often see the begat is the word. So this report begat that, begat that, begat that. And then what we end up getting is if you actually click those hyperlinks to check the source, the original source might have actually come from 20 years ago, but it's being brought forward in various iterations of reports, and they just reference a report as opposed to specific things. So I think when you go to websites where you're pulling down these types of industry reports or just ones that have been gathered, like summary type of reports, to really look at those links and sources. And if the data, that specific data and source is not given exactly, do the backtracking. So I think that will, that's certainly a quick thing that you can do, that we've been hit with it a couple of times when we realized.
Yes.
Yeah. Another question. There is a question, a quick one about RAnLab set up as a fee for service. So we are a little bit of a unique model here for the province for sure. But yes, RAnLab, it's a part of our university and part of the Harris Center, but we don't receive what we call base funding. So we work through a different type of a model where we do so much, where we try to work with community partners and organizations where we can apply resources to them. But then we also have a fee for service model, and that's where we hopefully use those projects to help support the overall aspects of RAnLab. So how that works means everything we do isn't a fee, but some things we have to do, but we are based on a revenue generation model. Most of the resources that we do are partnerships that we have, and that's where partnerships like we have right now with Future Skills doing this type of a work is really invaluable, because it helps us get a message out that we think is really important. Okay, question here. Someone made the comment that rural communities have their own challenges needing local intel that might not be available by Stats Canada. And then from that, there's a question afterwards that actually says, what's the best method of collecting local intel or data within small rural communities? I don't know if there's a best method, but there's different methods.
This is a very good question, and it's one that I don't have a prayer of answering it here now, but
some examples of how we've approached it.
Okay, in the past, so there's a bit of a distinction. I'd say, don't forget qualitative research about these things. And, interviews are really good, especially if you can, here we can, go and have a cup of tea or make some jigs dinner, invite people in, sort of thing, and help sort of smooth that over. For us, we've tried a few different approaches. One thing that we had some success with, one project a few years ago was in a very particular area of the province, and we ended up we went to the community college and we hired a couple of summer students because at least here you know, you grow up in a small town, you move to the city to go to college, go to university. A lot of times people are looking for summer work, right? They're looking for things to do to get back into town, spend some time at Nan, you know, while you're away from school. And so that was one thing we found very successful. We hired 2 or 3 students from the community college program, and that was their job, was to just, we're doing a bit of a census on the business structure. And they just went around talking to people, the people they know, their friends and whatnot, and their colleagues or the people in the community. And we gave them sort of a survey framework, went through the ethics approval and everything, and it came back, and we just sort of went and got work. And we got so much more information from them, I think, than if it was me or my supervisor that's going and yelling at people. So that worked really well. Yeah, other than that, I mean, we have you know, secondly from that is sort of through our more direct engagement activities with municipal councils and with the staff, as we have a bit of a, we do have a bit of a, what do you call it, a data platform that they can log into, and they can sort of upload and put in specific questions that we ask them that they're familiar with. And so there's different approaches, different ways.
I can add into, so from the university perspective, as we're part of the university, and I know we have some university people here, but a lot of just NGOs and different types of organizations. A lot of universities now do have very strong either community engagement or public engagement frameworks and research frameworks. So they're looking to do a lot more local projects that really help the communities in which the schools are located. That's always something to look in there, and that's the model that the Harris Center is based on with Memorial University here, Newfoundland and Labrador. Other than that, one of the very strong tips that we have for our organization, the university, we define public engagement, or our take on it is that there's mutual benefit. So not just to show up in a community looking for information, that there should be a benefit to that community to receive it. And so building relationships and partnerships from that basis can really help as well.
That's it.
As you're going into an area, so you're trying to get that type of information. The other side is that you don't go in like with the project already built. Now, sometimes we have a project and we're contracted by communities or asked by communities to come in and help them. So when you're asked in, that's always very different. But if you're going to come in through someone's front door, it's sometimes coming in, you know, with just your greeting and just a general message as opposed to with the intent. And we found that's really helped us as we develop our community-based research approaches. But it's very seldom that we've had a question to go work in a community where a community has said no, because those approaches really, yeah, I think really help with that. I see Sylvia on the screen. We must be at time.
We are at time. So I just wanted to thank you, Leslie, Jamie, and Kim again for this fantastic presentation, and to our participants for engaging throughout the presentation and sticking around. So with that, I think we can wrap up. Please keep an eye out in your inboxes for the resources that we mentioned, and we hope to see you at future events.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.